It's time for the third edition of Victorian Bro Code. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to Victober wrap-up and the third edition of the Victorian Bro Code. Every year I read Victorian classics during the month of October. There's a Victober celebration, and it's great, and I love it. And this year I read 6 books, 6 Victorian classics as a part of Victober. I'm going to review those books really quickly, and then I'm going to go on to the Bro Code, because the Victorians had a Bro Code just like we do today. So I read 6 books in October. The first book I read was Jill by Amy Dillwyn. Yeah, Amy Dillwyn. Jill is a really kind of all over the place novel with a plot that kind of goes in different places about a young woman who calls herself Jill, who, because her stepmother is mean and her father won't stick up for her, decides to leave home. She's, kind of in the minor league gentry in England at the time. She decides she's going to leave and she's going to become a lady's maid, and she's going to travel all over the world and have adventures, and that'll show her dad and her stepmom. And so she does, and she goes off and has all kinds of adventures, all kinds of things she does. She walks some dogs. She gets kidnapped by Sardinian ruffians and gets locked in a tomb. She makes friends. She kind of learns things about herself. Not always the most moral young lady. She breaks the rules. She tells a few lies. She misrepresents herself. And in the end, she's rewarded by, inheriting wealth from her father. I'm not sure what the object lesson that is, but Jill was interesting. Not my favorite book. The second book I read, and listened to this as an audiobook, was The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Now you may know, I really like The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which I read a few years ago, I think. Maybe it was the first, second, I can't remember. Victober Bro Code edition that I did. And so I thought I'll listen to The Time Machine because it's a classic. And I like the idea of the time machine. I like the idea of time travel. I saw some people talking about time travel books and movies and stuff, and what they said they liked is when they don't try to explain how the time travel works. And I have to agree, all that science doesn't really work for me anyway. I accept that people can travel in time. In a work of fiction, I think that's fine. So H.G. Wells doesn't really explain to us how this whole thing works. He kind of shows us a time machine and talks about the scientists he puts together. But, he travels in time. He goes forward into the future. Now, if it were me, I would not go into the future. Because you never know what's going to happen. That's what he's most curious about. I would go into the past. Of course, going into the past, you have to remember that you're moving in time and not space. So, wherever your time machine is, when you leave is where it's going to be when you get to the past. So you can't really go back and see the sign of the Declaration of Independence unless you're in Philadelphia. You see what I'm saying? Anyway, so in the time machine, he travels into the future. He comes to a civilization in the future where there are these little tiny people called the Eloi who seem to be really friendly and kind of weird. If you ask me, they're kind of like hippies. In 1960, they kind of live communally. It's a really beautiful place. And he goes and he hangs out with them, and while he's gone, the Morlocks, the bad guys in the novel, steal his time machine, and he has to get it back. And in the process of trying to get it back, he learns about this society, how maybe the Morlocks are not really all that bad, and maybe the Eloi are not really all that good. But he still brains a whole bunch of Morlocks with a big metal pipe, and he gets his time machine back, and he manages to return to his own day, but not before he goes even further into the future, where it's just like slime and not very much light and oceans and weird sea critters and stuff like that. It's kind of interesting, scared me just a little bit. But I didn't like it as much as War of the Worlds. The third book I read, and this was one I didn't have on my TBR, was Agnes by Anne Bronte. You may know that I love The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall by Anne Bronte. It's my favorite Bronte novel. I thought, what I should do, since so many people this month for Victober seem to be reading The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall, ooh, I will read Agnes Grey, Anne Bronte's other novel. And so I read it when I listened to it as an audiobook. And, it tells the story of Agnes Grey, who essentially goes off to become a governess because of financial problems in their own family. And, it really is a former teacher. The scenes with the kids who are misbehaving really, kind of activated by teacher PTSD made me a little tense. But on top of that, it's a fairly conventional love story in which, Agnes meets and falls in love with a man you expect she would meet and fall in love with. And so in that sense, it's not a real surprise. I found it to be kind of a pleasant experience once I got past the PTSD involving teaching. The next book on my list was Olive by Dinah Craick. I'm not going to do all the middle names, but Olive by Dinah Craick. This book I liked a lot, even though I kind of thought it was a little bit long, a little bit drawn out at the end. You know, my attention span is not that long. But I listened to it, and essentially, it's about this young woman named, surprise, surprise, her name is Olive. And she's born, and her mom is really beautiful, and her dad is really handsome. But Olive has born with, essentially what they refer to in the book is deformity. Apparently, she's slightly hunchbacked, and this then ruins her parents' life. They're like, oh my God, we can't believe we have this kid with this deformity. Her dad's mean, her mom's like, how can I be so beautiful and have this kid? And, Dinah grows up and realizes she's different and that people kind of either sympathize with her or they avoid her or they mock her because of this kind of slight hunchback. As she grows older, though, the hunchback seems to kind of go away. Still noticeable. Some people still know and they still treat her differently. But, on the whole, she's able to, find a life and live relatively happily through self-denial. And then she falls in love. Oh man, it is a love story taking a long, long time to develop. And then finally in the end, it ends the way you'd expect it to end. And I found the book to be really good. Olive to be a character who may be a little bit too good to be true. This seems to be an issue with Victorian novels in the whole. And by the way, you may know that I really don't like Wuthering Heights, but at the very least, Wuthering Heights is not all about these incredibly virtuous people. Anyway, I liked Olive. It was okay. The next book I read was The Unclassed by George Gissing. You may know that George Gissing is my boy. Really liked The Odd Women. Really, really liked New Grub Street. So I thought, I'll read The Unclassed. And The Unclassed is essentially about a group of people who kind of exist in London society in a space in which they really don't have a social class. They're not poor. They're not uneducated. They're not always poor. They're not always uneducated. They're not too poor, too uneducated. Maybe that's what I should say. And they kind of live in this gray area. And since they live in this kind of gray area between the classes, the moral code they're supposed to follow also seems to be a little bit gray. Our main character, whose name is Osmond Way something. What is his name? Let me look it up. His name is Osmond Wayrap. Anyway, our main character is named Osmond, and he is a teacher at first. More PTSD teacher stress for me. And he decides to leave the teaching profession because where he teaches is just terrible, and he wants to be a writer. And he kind of falls in love with this woman who is a prostitute. And then he falls in love with another woman who was a tutor and is incredibly virtuous. And his kind of life is kind of ping-ponging between these two love interests. He kind of refuses for a long time to accept that he is actually in love with the prostitute. And he plans to marry the young woman who is more virtuous by the time period. And then, all kinds of misadventures and things like that happen. And I liked it. It's not going to be my favorite George Gissing. There's kind of a theme here in my Victober reading that none of it was excellent. None of it shredded. Except his last one. Gotcha. And that is, The Small House in Allington by, Anthony Trollope. This is the 5th book in the Chronicles of Barchester, and I really liked it. I liked it much more than Framley Parsonage or Dr. Thorne. It involves a small house in Allington, occupied by a mother and her 2 daughters. Their last name is Dale. And they're living in the small house in Allington, which is on a part of the property of their uncle, the Squire of Dale, who owns the big house. Anyway, Belle and Lily Dale are the 2 daughters, and the story mainly revolves around Lily Dale and her love life, because she meets a young man through the Squire and through her cousin, whose last name is Dale too, I believe. She meets this man, she falls in love with him, and he asks her to marry him. They kiss, they smooch, they walk around, and she's really in love. You think, this guy is the guy. But then we start to find out slowly, and this is kind of, I think, the brilliance of the novel. We find out slowly this guy is not a good guy. He wants money. He starts regretting his decision to ask Lily to marry him. And there are problems because of this. And then he goes off to a really rich family, the DeCourcy family, who may recognize from other books in the Martians Chronicle series. And he decides to ask another woman to marry him. A wealthy woman who can, help him in his career and has more money. And, everything kind of gets out of control from there. There's another young man who's in love with Lily Bart. His name is John Eames. And he wants to marry Lily, but Lily has her heart broken and she refuses to marry anybody. And we have these kind of parallel plots going on with John Eames and how he's treating a young woman at the boarding house where he lives, even though he loves Lily Ames. And there's a lot of kind of moral questioning going on here and a lot of kind of funny things, particularly as Trollope often does, kind of skewering aspects of a Victorian society, in this case, government offices and the way they work and the way employees work. I really, really liked it. Again, I listened to this in audiobook. There you go. There's the wrap up for my Victober. Man, that took a lot longer than I thought I was going to do. And now on to the Bro Code. So every year for Victober, what I do is I come up with 10 rules. 10 rules that are part of the Victorian Bro Code. 10 things that Victorian bros should know, rules they should follow. So rule number 1 for this year, 3rd edition, is walks are romantic. Man, it appears as though in the Victorian times, going for a walk with your love interest was the way to win her heart. Maybe it's because the only time you can have private, quiet conversations with them, because usually you're being chaperoned around other people. But walking, not only is it great cardio, don't discount walking, but it's a key to winning your lady's heart. This was true in Olive and Agnes Grey. Bro Code rule number 2 from the Victorian era, 3rd edition, is be a good father. There are a lot of bad fathers, bad father figures in the books I read this month. Men who reject their kids, who don't take care of their kids, who don't look out for their interests, who try to control their daughters or their daughter figures. And it's a bad thing, and it causes problems, so be a good father. Bro Code rule number 3, and this one's hard for me personally. I struggle. Not something I shred. Bro Code rule number 3 is share your feelings. Man, the gentlemen in Olive and in A Small House at Allington don't share their feelings, and as a result, they almost, in some cases, do lose the loves of their lives. This is a mistake. Share your feelings. Let people know how you feel about them. Bro Code rule number 4, and this really applies to today. Don't hold a woman's past against her. That's none of your business. If you like her, if you love her, those things shouldn't matter. Oswin, whatever the hell his name is in the Unclassed, almost loses the woman he loves because he can't accept her past. He can't accept that he would be with somebody with that past. It drives me crazy throughout the book, and he almost loses her. Bro Code rule number 5, don't be a cad. I had to look up what a cad was. I didn't know. I thought it was short for Cadillac. Anyway, so don't be a cad. That Crosby guy from the Small House at Allington is the definition of a cad. He asks Lily to marry him, and then he asks another rich woman to marry him, and he has to break it off with Lily, and it destroys her. She decides she can never be happy again, never love again. She remains in love with this guy who treated her like dirt. Made me so mad. Makes John Eames mad too. We'll get back to that. Don't be a cad. Be a man of honor. Bro Code rule number 6, don't be too prideful. It's important to have self-respect. It's important to be strong in who you are. But don't be so prideful that you don't let yourself fall in love, that you don't tell people how you feel about them, that you ruin those relationships. This almost happens in Olive, as I told you. Harold Gwyn, my God, just tell Olive you love her. Olive, tell Harold Gwyn that you love him. Don't be so prideful. It also is true in a lesser way with the squire in the Small House at Allington, who is so prideful he can't let his sister-in-law and his nieces really know how he feels about them. And he almost loses them as a result. He doesn't, but he almost does. Bro Code rule number 7, this is going to be hard for lots of people. You have to accept being in the friend zone. If you get friend zoned, if a woman tells you that she thinks of you only as a friend, you have to accept that. It's not your job to try to convince her to love you. She knows how she feels. And if you can't be friends with this woman, you never were. If all you can think about when you're in the friend zone is how to get this woman to love you, you're not a friend because she's told you how she feels. You have to accept that. John Eames can't accept it. Other characters in other books I read can't accept it. One guy, the guy in Jill, he actually moves from the friend zone and marries the woman he loves. But she doesn't really love him. She marries him for convenience and they have an unhappy marriage. You don't want that. Accept being in the friend zone. Enjoy being friends with these women you like. And leave it at that. Bro Code rule number 8, 3rd edition. Don't invest money in things you don't understand. This is a general good rule for life, but 2 characters in books I read, 2 fathers, Olive's dad and Agnes Gray's dad, make investments, I think in foreign overseas things that happen in the United States of America. They don't really understand and they lose money. And as a result, they die. They lose their family and they die. That's bad. You don't want that. Bro Code rule number 9, and man, is this a tough one. Don't punch a guy to get a girl. It doesn't work. You could go to jail, you could lose your job, and you may not get the girl anyway. Go back and see what I said about the friend zone one. This one definitely comes from the small house in Allington. By the way, Trollope likes to have a lot of guys beat up other guys. And Bro Code rule number 10, and this one's really, really specific. I don't know how applicable it might be in your daily life, but here it is. Don't leave your time machine unattended overnight. The Morlocks will come and steal it, and then you'll have to kill a bunch of Morlocks to get back to where you're supposed to be. Anyway, there you go. There is the 3rd edition of the Victorian Bro Code. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below. As always, thank you for watching.